we have people waiting in the wings here who are the equivalent of the American Taliban. And the irony is we're out there fighting an international war against terrorism in the name of religion. And in our own country, we have people who essentially, if you just change the theology slightly, would actually be on the Taliban side. They'd happily enough see gays killed for being gay. They would force children to have a certain type of education based on their view of what the Bible was, and start their version of madrasas, if you want to put it that way. We've got a religious underbelly in this country that is generally white, is often not terribly educated, is very filled with hate and fear and paranoia for the other, and I think also walks around with a big chip on its shoulder, regarding itself as a kind of beleaguered minority, which is, alas, since they've controlled basically both houses of Congress and the presidency on and off for the last 30-plus years. And yet, refer to themselves as somehow, this poor beleaguered minority that gets picked on by the liberal media, when you really look at what's happening, for instance, the way through their lies and agitation they stalled the health care debate and brought it to a standstill by invading town meetings with screaming hordes of people following a kind of a script on how to derail the process, and then you've got the teabag party and all the rest of it. This is no joke. You only have to look at the history of Europe in the 1920s and 1930s to realize that this stuff actually can get out of hand and derail an entire country, let alone a democracy.
Well, Franklin Graham spent a lot of time in Alaska with his Samaritan's Purse. He's got a lodge here, et cetera.
Right.
And she, a year ago, there were, in Western Alaska, people were starving, and she waited. Sarah Palin waited and waited for Franklin to come up so she could fly out there to do a photo op with them, and made them cookies when they were starving because they didn't have fish. It was really there for the photo op, and disconnected. Reverend Muthi, as you said, the Kenyan witch hunting pastor who anointed her, basically. It's very strange that she's gone as far as she has. 569-1080 is the number here. So I want to ask you, today was Obama's, he went to the prayer breakfast. And you had put out a post yesterday that was really critical, and then you said, would Obama speak for a KKK prayer breakfast?
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, let me first start by saying the most controversial piece I've written recently was something defending Obama, saying the left has been far too critical of him. I'm one of these guys at the Huffington Post and Alternet and these other blogs that has actually stuck up for Obama's patient, long-term policy initiatives when all kinds of progressive people want things much quicker. And I could be right or I could be wrong about that. That's not my point. I'm just giving that as a preface so that what I was writing about was this. Look, the family and this gang at C Street in Washington, D.C. is this very shadowy, nefarious kind of evangelical right-wing, far right-wing group. I mean, far right even for the evangelical world, that goes right back into the 30s and 40s in terms of their roots, in the kind of post-Roosevelt witch-hunting McCarthy era. For instance, some of their key members worked very hard to get the U.S. to be more friendly to Franco's fascist Spain and said, let's work with Franco. So they have a long history of far-right, even fascist sympathy. And this isn't some new, Sarah Palin-era group. These folks predate, the religious right even. They're back into the sort of John Birch era of right-wing activism, off-the-wall conspiracy theorist kind of people. Well, fast forward, they were some of their key members, not people affiliated with them, they're actual leaders in Uganda who are high up in the government, initiated this bill to execute gay people for being gay. And they got caught with their pants down, no pun intended, because Jeff Charlotte, who's a friend of mine, by the way, wrote this book, The Family, and exposed the family at the very time that this stuff was coming along. Well, there's a little fact here that most evangelicals don't want to recognize, and that is the family organized every year and has from the very beginning when it was founded this National Prayer Breakfast, and they do it for the same reason that the Moonies started the Washington Times, and that is a really nice cover to give them access to politics, influence, and power in Washington as a squirrely sect and to try to improve their image. Well, I don't know whether it worked for the Moonies or not. The Washington Times is still around, and conservatives quote it, but it certainly worked for the family until this thing with Uganda, which kind of exposed them for the craziness that they've been in this generation. So anyway, my blog was simply to call on President Obama to boycott it and just say, look, what are you doing having anything to do with this, whether all these evangelical leaders roll up or not? And secondly, what are the evangelical leaders take a Franklin Graham, for instance, or a Rick Warren or any of these other people, got anything to do with a national annual event, which is really nothing more than cover, to provide cover for a neo-fascist, off-the-wall group of Reconstructionists who believe that essentially America has to be reconstructed along Old Testament biblical lines. And if they could have gotten away with it, and if Jeff and some other people hadn't spotted it, would have happily helped sponsor this legislation in Uganda to execute gay people, something they would like to do here but couldn't do. So they export this right-wing crazy stuff to other parts of the world. And the family's really a nasty outfit, and Jeff isn't the only person who's written about this, and a lot more is going to be coming out about it. So I just think it goes to show once again that so much evangelical activity in America, and again, mea culpa, I have a lot to do with this back into the 70s and 80s as I talk about in Patience with God, was about access to power and getting drunk on that power just like I did, which is why I stayed in the movement for several years after. I knew perfectly well that it was morally bankrupt, but I hung around for the paycheck, and I hung around for access to the White House, and I hung around because it's cool to fly around in private jets. And finally, even I had enough, and by the mid-'80s I was out, which I talk about in my memoir, Crazy for God, as well. So I kind of know the territory, and I was just shocked that Obama would do this, given that he's a progressive person and should know better.
Well, I wasn't surprised that he went after he had invited Rick Warren to do the inauguration invocation.
Right.
That was a strange sign.
It just goes to show you how deeply embedded these folks are in our system, that President Obama feels that he has to reach out to Rick Warren, who then turns around, uses his good offices to help spearhead the defeat of Proposition 8 in California, and all these other folks. I mean, the gay bashing is just the least of it. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The real thing is this long affinity with far right-wing causes, even going back into the pro-fascist, anti-Roosevelt era of people like Father Reverend Coughlin, who was a Roman Catholic rabble-rouser, very much like a Jerry Falwell for another period of time. These guys at the family have their roots back into that period, and they're unrepentant. Doug Coe, the leader, has not stood up. He sent some people out to calm the waters onto various shows and so forth, but he himself has not in any way denounced this legislation. He's remained quiet about it. He hasn't denounced his people who have been involved in it, any more than he stood up and talked about the gross hypocrisy of right-wing Americans who talk about family values turning out to all be philandering adulterers living in his property that he was kind of covering for in C Street. So, these guys are rotten to the core, and I was just really surprised that Obama would have anything to do with them.
I am as well. I know that he did mention this morning at the prayer breakfast that he said, we don't agree on gay marriage. We don't have to agree on gay marriage, but we can all agree that what's happening in Uganda is wrong. And I was encouraged to see that, at least it was being said, and maybe get out there in more mainstream a little bit more than just MSNBC with our good friends Keith and Rachel. So I did talk to a friend last night who said that he could write a book called Crazy for Frank Schaeffer.
Oh, that's nice.
He said that he just thought the world of you, and I think it's really brave to be able to be so committed to something, realize it's wrong, and then be able to try to correct it or to at least acknowledge it. That's so, for some reason, that just flies in the face of who we are as Americans, to say, oh, I was wrong. But to write it and to do it the way you are is really brave, and I really appreciate your work.
Well, thank you so much.
I appreciate you coming on. Frank Schaeffer.